The global order is not collapsing because of a decisive military defeat on a traditional open battlefield. It is currently bleeding out mathematically in a 30-meter deep, 3-kilometer wide maritime choke point and through the calculated systemic paralysis of the United Nations Security Council. What the international community is witnessing is not a sudden escalation of regional hostilities, but the mathematical culmination of a 4-decade asymmetric strategy designed to dismantle the deterrence architecture of the United States and Israel. Through an intricate synchronization of ballistic missile salvos, intelligent naval mine deployment, and macroeconomic warfare, an alliance of regional and global powers has engineered a scenario where the world's preeminent military empire is functionally paralyzed. The recent cessation of hostilities requested by the Israel Defense Forces was not a political maneuver. It was the arithmetic conclusion of a command structure that realized its active defense grid had been mathematically exhausted. Simultaneously, the geoeconomic foundation of American hegemony, the petrodollar, is being structurally dismantled as the Strait of Hormuz remains systematically denied to Western commercial shipping. This analysis will deconstruct the operational, strategic, and macroeconomic mechanics of how the United States and its regional allies were maneuvered into an unwinnable matrix, definitively marking the transition from American unipolarity to a multipolar world order. To comprehend the strategic entrapment of the United States Navy, an analyst must first examine the specific geographic and bathymetric constraints of the operational theater. The Strait of Hormuz measures 54 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, yet the actual navigable shipping channels required for commercial and military transit are merely 3 kilometers wide. The average water depth along these critical shipping lanes is approximately 30 meters. When juxtaposed against the primary subsurface assets of the United States, the geographic incompatibility becomes glaringly obvious. The American Ohio-class submarines, representing the apex of Western undersea projection, are 170 meters long and displace 18,000 tons of water. From an operational standpoint, you cannot fit an Ohio-class submarine in water that is 30 meters deep, nor can you safely maneuver a vessel of that displacement within a confined 3-kilometer channel. Consequently, the American Navy's most powerful undersea platforms, explicitly designed to hunt and neutralize enemy submarines, cannot even enter the operational environment where the primary threat resides. Operating within this geographic blind spot is an asymmetric naval asset meticulously designed for this exact environment. Iran has deployed 16 Ghadir-class submarines, vessels that measure a mere 29 meters in length and operate with a displacement of only 150 tons. These coastal submarines are small enough to effortlessly navigate the shallow channels that preclude American subsurface operations. More critically, their acoustic signature is functionally negated by the operational environment. When a Ghadir-class submarine settles onto the seabed and shuts down its acoustic electric propulsion system, its minimal noise emissions are completely masked by the constant ambient acoustic saturation generated by overhead commercial surface traffic. Within 30 meters of water, the most sophisticated American sonar arrays cannot reliably separate the acoustic profile of a stationary Ghadir submarine from the background noise of the busy waterway. This stealth capability is explicitly paired with a highly sophisticated area denial payload. Each Ghadir submarine is capable of carrying between 4 and 8 naval mines per mission. Iran's arsenal has evolved far beyond traditional contact explosives. It currently includes magnetic mines triggered by hull signatures, acoustic mines calibrated to specific vessel sound profiles, and pressure mines activated by hydrodynamic displacement. From an operational perspective, the most severe threat stems from intelligent mines, specifically the Maham 3 and Maham 7 variants, which possess the programming to distinguish between military vessels and commercial tankers. This capability allows Iran to theoretically seed a minefield that selectively detonates against American or Allied warships while allowing civilian shipping to pass. However, the psychological and economic impact of this selective mining creates a de facto blockade. The Pentagon has officially confirmed the deployment of at least 12 of these mines in the strait, their exact locations, triggering mechanisms, and targeting profiles remaining entirely unknown. While 12 mines cannot physically block all maritime transit, the statistical risk is mathematically sufficient to halt it entirely. Maritime insurance underwriters immediately render transit economically non-viable, while vessel captains deem the physical danger professionally unacceptable. The American counter-operation, designated Operation Mysterious Fury, serves as a prime case study in the failure of conventional military metrics when applied to an asymmetric environment. Washington publicly announced the destruction of 11 Iranian submarines, attempting to project a narrative of operational success. An objective analysis of the target list, however, reveals a profound strategic failure. The destroyed assets included the 600-ton Fateh-class and 3 Russian-manufactured Kilo-class submarines. These were Iran's largest, deepest diving, and most acoustically detectable platforms, operating in areas where American sonar functions effectively. The 29-meter Ghadir-class submarines, the actual asymmetric threat, resting on the shallow seabed of the strait, were not destroyed because American surveillance architecture simply could not detect them. You cannot destroy an asset you cannot mathematically locate. This glaring operational vulnerability is precisely why America's European allies, including Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Spain, categorically declined to deploy their specialized minesweeping and anti-submarine frigates into the strait. European military planners executed a rational risk assessment determining that deploying naval assets into a confined maritime choke point saturated with undetectable submarines, intelligent mines, and shore-launched anti-ship missiles constituted a risk profile far exceeding any realistic political benefit. If the United States Navy could clear the strait at an acceptable risk, it would not require European assistance to accomplish the mission. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz must not be analyzed strictly as a military blockade, but as a deliberate acceleration of a global macroeconomic realignment. This brings us to the structural shift that occurred at the United Nations Security Council on April 7, 2026. When a resolution originally drafted by Bahrain and the United States was presented seeking international legal authorization to utilize all necessary military force to reopen the strait, China and Russia executed a calculated veto. Western analysts inaccurately frame this veto as a simple act of shielding an ally. A structural analysis reveals a far more sophisticated geopolitical stratagem. China imports millions of barrels of oil daily, heavily relying on Gulf transit. In the short term, the blockade of Hormuz undeniably inflicts economic friction upon the Chinese economy. However, Beijing operates on a long-term strategic timeline, recognizing that the closure of the strait inadvertently accelerates its most vital geopolitical objective, the de-dollarization of global trade and the dismantling of the petrodollar system. Since 1973, the foundational architecture of American economic hegemony has relied on the recycling of petrodollars. Gulf states sell energy exclusively in US dollars, generating permanent global demand for the currency, which allows Washington to run enormous deficits and finance its expansive military empire. When the Strait of Hormuz is closed, Gulf states cannot export oil, petrodollars cease flowing, and these nations stop recycling capital back into American stock markets and artificial intelligence data centers. The financial architecture of American power begins to structurally fracture. China calculates that absorbing short-term energy friction is a highly favorable exchange rate for the systemic degradation of the American financial system. Furthermore, China has spent 2 decades immunizing its supply chains against this exact scenario. Beijing has aggressively built strategic petroleum reserves, diversified its energy suppliers, and developed massive domestic renewable energy capacities, including solar, wind, and nuclear infrastructure. Geopolitically, China has established alternative overland logistics, such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which grants maritime access to the Arabian Sea, entirely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz, and the North-South Transport Corridor, linking Russia and Iran. Therefore, the Chinese veto at the UN Security Council was not merely diplomatic obstruction, it was a definitive declaration that the unipolar era, wherein the United States could universally dictate the rules of the global economic order, has mathematically ended. Simultaneous to this macroeconomic warfare, the aerospace theater witnessed a meticulously calculated saturation of the most advanced integrated air defense system on the planet. The joint military operation executed by Iran and Hezbollah against Israel was not a sudden retaliation. It was a synchronized algorithmic assault planned over years. Recognizing that penetrating the Israeli active defense grid required exceeding the system's absolute intercept assignment capacity, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah engineered a dual-axis threat matrix. The operation was initiated with the simultaneous launch of 450 Shahab-3 medium-range ballistic missiles from geographically dispersed mobile transporter erector launchers deep within Iranian territory. Dispersing these assets ensured that preemptive destruction by American or Israeli strike packages was operationally impossible. Concurrent with the ballistic missile launches, Hezbollah activated its entire northern strike capability, firing 2,500 rockets and precision munitions from positions across southern Lebanon. The mathematics of intercept capacity dictate the outcome of such an engagement. Each Israeli Arrow 3 battery, designed specifically for exoatmospheric ballistic missile interception, is constrained by its radar refresh rate, target tracking algorithms, and the physical reload cycle of its interceptors. Iran recognized these parameters and doctrinalized their launch sequences. The Shahab-3 missiles were fired in concentrated salvos of 15 to 20 units, programmed to arrive at their designated target areas from multiple approach vectors within compressed 45-second to 90-second windows. This specific timing forces an Arrow 3 battery to exceed its simultaneous engagement limit. The system must prioritize the most immediate threats and accept mathematical leakage on the remainder. Iran explicitly calculated this precise leakage rate for every battery in the Israeli architecture, sizing their salvos to ensure that a critical mass of warheads would predictably reach their targets regardless of the defense system's optimized performance. This saturation was exponentially compounded by the Hezbollah barrage, which served two distinct operational functions. First, it forced the Israeli Defense Command to fracture its interceptor allocation, dividing radar processing and missile inventory between the high-altitude ballistic threat from the east and the massive low-altitude rocket threat from the north. Second, the barrage was designed as an asymmetric economic exhaustion trap. Hezbollah heavily utilized short-range Katyusha rockets, which cost approximately $300 per unit to manufacture. Every time the Iron Dome successfully engages a Katyusha, it consumes a Tamir interceptor valued at $50,000. Across thousands of individual intercepts, this exchange ratio generates a financial and logistical hemorrhage that systematically drains the defensive capability of the state. While the Iron Dome processors were saturated tracking cheap rocket artillery, Hezbollah deployed its highly accurate Fateh 110 precision-guided missiles, directing them against high-value targets, including the physical locations of the Iron Dome and David's Sling batteries themselves. This represents a tactical masterclass. The defensive architecture is blinded and consumed by the diversionary barrage, leaving it entirely vulnerable to precision decapitation. The diversity of the Iranian payloads further paralyzed the Israeli intercept algorithms. The 450 Shahab-3 missiles did not carry uniform warheads. Conventional high-explosive warheads were allocated for hardened command nodes. A significant percentage of the salvo utilized cluster munition warheads targeted at critical airfields, such as Nevatim and Ramon. An analyst assessing cluster munitions understands that a single inbound missile is not a single target. Upon the payload opening, it fractures into 80 independently descending submunitions distributed across a 10-kilometer radius. No existing defense grid possesses the radar track processing capacity to simultaneously engage such a voluminous target dispersion. Furthermore, Iran integrated specialized electronic warfare and electromagnetic pulse warheads targeted specifically at radar installations to corrupt the early warning tracking picture. At the exact moment, absolute radar clarity was required. By the 11th minute of the engagement, the synchronized saturation caused system-wide leakage into the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. Arrow 3 batteries had depleted roughly 70% of their available interceptor inventories, and local Iron Dome units were locked in protracted reload cycles, exposing the urban centers to undefended follow-on waves. Confronted with the complete degradation of its defensive shield, unsustainable casualty projections for its ground forces engaging Hezbollah's Radwan units in the north, and a neutralized air force unable to generate counter-battery sorties, the IDF command executed a rational mathematical assessment. They transmitted an emergency request for a cessation of hostilities under duress, effectively surrendering to the arithmetic of the asymmetric barrage to prevent the total annihilation of the state's remaining military capacity. The geopolitical ramifications of this military paralysis are absolute and highly detrimental to American strategic interests. The Trump administration finds itself cornered in what veteran geopolitical expert Professor John Mearsheimer correctly identifies as a systemic lose-lose matrix. The United States has fundamentally lost the capacity to dictate outcomes in the Middle East through military force. If the administration pursues an escalatory path, potentially initiating a ground offensive into Iranian territory, it commits to an unwinnable quagmire that would fail to achieve strategic objectives while severely degrading American troop readiness. The American public, already enduring domestic gasoline prices escalating to $7 a gallon due to the Hormuz blockade, lacks the political endurance to finance another protracted intervention. Alternatively, if Washington seeks an off-ramp by conceding to Iranian demands, which recently included a rejected 15-point ceasefire proposal wherein Iran demanded recognized sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and the payment of massive war reparations, the administration suffers a catastrophic collapse of global credibility. The previous attempt to degrade Iran's capabilities during the June 2025 escalation, labeled Operation Rising Lion, clearly illustrates this dynamic. Although the United States and Israel inflicted severe damage upon Iranian nuclear sites using deep penetrating bunker busters and eliminating key commanders, the core objective of the operation completely failed. The Islamic Republic did not collapse. Instead, Iran absorbed the strikes, inflicted its own damage, and effectively eradicated international nuclear oversight by terminating cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran entered the conflict with a damaged nuclear program and exited with unchecked operational autonomy. The true strategic objective of the Iranian axis of resistance has never been to achieve a conventional military victory against the United States. Rather, it is designed to initiate a slow, systemic bleed. By keeping the United States permanently entangled in the Middle East, managing localized proxy conflagrations, Iran successfully forces Washington to abandon its broader geopolitical imperatives. The primary beneficiary of this American entanglement is the Sino-Russian strategic alignment. For decades, the United States defined its grand strategy around a pivot to Asia, intent on structurally containing the rise of China. Currently, Washington is executing the exact opposite maneuver. Desperate to salvage the deteriorating security environment surrounding Israel and the Persian Gulf, the Pentagon is systematically draining its critical military assets from the Indo-Pacific theater, pulling resources away from crucial outposts in Japan and South Korea. This pivot away from Asia effectively dismantles the American containment architecture, granting Beijing unobstructed latitude to expand its influence. In parallel, the crisis serves as an immense strategic windfall for the Russian Federation. The global energy shortage precipitated by the Hormuz blockade forced the United States to quietly remove economic sanctions on Russian oil to prevent a total collapse of the global market. Furthermore, the insatiable demand for air defense interceptors and munitions in the Middle East has drastically decelerated the flow of American military aid to Ukraine, directly facilitating Russian operational superiority in that theater. The final dimension of this systemic failure involves the collapse of American naval deterrence. When the White House Situation Room evaluated the potential deployment of carrier strike groups to provide Israel with desperately needed air cover, they were confronted with the undeniable reality of Iran's anti-access area denial capabilities. The USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Theodore Roosevelt are currently restricted to operating at extreme standoff distances because American Naval Command has analytically determined that operating within the launch parameters of Iranian anti-ship missile systems constitutes an unacceptable operational risk. A carrier strike group commander understands that their point defense systems cannot mathematically guarantee interception during a massive multi-vector saturation attack utilizing advanced anti-ship ballistics. Therefore, the most potent symbol of American global power, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, has been rendered strategically impotent, forced to observe the conflict from the periphery while its regional allies capitulate under duress. An objective analysis of the current geopolitical and military landscape yields a definitive conclusion. The architecture of American hegemony has suffered a critical, irrecoverable systemic failure. The conflict was not lost due to an absence of technological sophistication or military funding. It was lost to the ruthless mathematics of asymmetric warfare, geographic constraints, and macroeconomic vulnerability. The United States Navy is geographically locked out of the operational theater. The Israeli integrated air defense grid has been algorithmically saturated, and the global economic reliance on the American dollar is being systematically eroded by the strategic maneuvers of a rising multipolar coalition. The strategic calculus dictates that regardless of whether the Trump administration attempts a military escalation or pursues a diplomatic capitulation, the overarching objectives of the Iranian axis, alongside the broader ambitions of China and Russia, have already been fundamentally advanced. The deterrence mechanism that dictated global stability for over 75 years has been shattered, not by an equal superpower, but by an intelligently engineered exhaustion trap. The post-war paradigm will inevitably feature a severely wounded United States, a dramatically diminished Israel, and a global order increasingly dictated by the strategic priorities of Beijing and Moscow. The transition is complete, and the rules of international power projection have been permanently rewritten.